talking about some case histories and later tell you why. I first want to talk about people who had very little schooling, sometimes none, and were quite successful. And I want to begin with my favorite case. How many of you have heard of a man named Michael Faraday? Those of you who've studied science know all about Michael Faraday. Albert Einstein had 3 pictures on his wall: Newton, Maxwell, and Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday was born, quite a while ago. I got his birthday here somewhere. 1791, around 1800. He lived in poverty in London, and when he was a little boy, about 10 years old, he had to drop out of school. The family needed the money, and he went to work. He went to work for a bookbinder in London. This bookbinder changed the world. The kindness of one man, he was a wonderful man, helped us today. He told Michael, come work for me, bind the books, do the work, it's a lot of work, but look at all the books around you. Take your time, read some of them. The bookbinder not only was a bookbinder, but he had a small bookstore. As a result, Michael Faraday had access to more books than nearly anyone in London. He spent the next 10 years reading what he wanted to read for hours and hours every day. He read fiction, he read nonfiction. Gradually, as he got older, he found out what he was really interested in. The books that really interested him the most were science books. He found a book called Conversations about Chemistry and just devoured it. He found a book about physical science. When he was 20, he decided that what he wanted to do was to become a scientist. He became an apprentice to the most famous chemist in the United Kingdom at the time, a man named Humphrey Davy, and began doing research with Dr. Humphrey. When he was 26, he published his first paper. He went on to a stunning career. He brought together chemistry and physics. He basically discovered electromagnetism. He was a real pioneer. Michael Faraday never studied. Michael Faraday never took a test. He knew more than anyone in the world about science. He did the 2 things. I'm giving you my final message. I could actually stop now, because I'm going to tell you what the main point is. He did the 2 things that are essential for intellectual development: reading for pleasure and trying to solve problems of interest to him. Those are the 2 factors. That's all you need, and that's what schools should be doing. Okay, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison dropped out of school when he was 8 years old. Actually, he was kicked out of school when he was 8 years old. His teacher said he was just impossible. He didn't want to go to school. His mother took him out of school, taught him to read at home. That was his entire schooling. He got a job on a train that went from New York to New Haven, Connecticut. Took several hours. He sold newspapers on the train, and he sold, drinks and candy and snacks on the way back. During the layover, while the train was in New Haven, he had several hours with nothing to do. Guess what? Across the street of the railroad station was a library. Thomas Edison spent all that time in the library reading. He went on to get more creative patents than anyone in history, changed the world in electricity. Again, didn't take tests, didn't study. He read what he wanted to read, and he spent his life solving problems that he thought were interesting. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. If you look at biographies of Abraham Lincoln, it looks like he went to school for a few years when he was very young, but when you total up all the hours he was in school, which one scholar did, he might have had the equivalent of a year of schooling. That's all. Just basic reading, writing, etc. He was interested in books. He was interested in reading. The more he read, the more he realized what his interests were. His interests were in history, philosophy, the law, and politics. He ran for Congress, became a representative from Illinois, and eventually became President of the United States, and again, changed the world. You know what I'm going to say now? Abraham Lincoln never studied. Abraham Lincoln never took a test. He read for pleasure and got involved in areas that he felt were interesting. We also have cases of students who were former students who were very successful in life, but went to school and weren't very good at it. They finished it. Probably a famous case is George Orwell, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm. George Orwell's biographer said that George Orwell was considered a very poor student in school and a lazy student. He never did the required reading. He had his own reading list. He decided what was important, became one of the most important writers and philosophers of his time. Moving on, Albert Einstein, we all know this. Albert Einstein's math instructor, great quote, said, "Einstein was a lazy dog." No, he wasn't. He just didn't do the schoolwork. He got involved in work he thought was important. He finished his doctorate. He got a doctorate in physics. He didn't drop out. But it wasn't a first-class doctorate, PhD. It was considered a second-class PhD. And he couldn't do it in residence at the university. He had to leave. He worked at a patent office in Bern and spent most of his time studying on his own on problems he thought were important. Einstein said that after the yearly examinations, the one big set that he took in secondary school, he said he was so turned off by study, even science and math, that he couldn't do anything productive for an entire year. Does that sound familiar? That's how we feel most of the time, I know. Isaac Newton. My goodness, Isaac Newton is the same way. If you look at Hans Ohanian's biography of Einstein, he has a huge section on Newton. Newton was exactly the same way. Not a successful student. He didn't go with the way other students were studying. He found his own list of things he wanted to study, and as you know, he became the great physicist and mathematician. Well, we do have odd cases here. They're in trouble explaining. I'm going to try. Students who did well in school and were also famous. It can be done. I have three cases for you. Two scientists, Robert Oppenheimer and Madame Curie, who were both award winners. Oppenheimer was considered the most brilliant student who ever went through MIT, and he became the #1 atomic scientist in the United States. Madame Curie was the best student ever to go to the Sorbonne. 2 Nobel Prizes, okay, chemistry, physics, outstanding. And I have a third case, I'll tell you about him, and then I'll give you what I think was going on. The third case is Larry Hyman, who's a friend of mine. Larry Hyman and I were students together. He eventually went on to become the chairman of the department at USC, and the first thing he did was hire me, which is a good move for both of us. Then he abandoned me. He left and became chair of the department at Berkeley, and we still remain very close. We were students together. When we started graduate school in linguistics, I was 27 years old. He was 21. He was the boy wonder. We loved him. Nobody was jealous because he was so nice, so friendly, and so full of enthusiasm, and he still is. When he was a graduate student in his first class, in a class called Field Methods, where you investigate the grammar of a language you don't know, it was an African language, and he discovered a phenomenon in phonological theory that no one had never noticed before. He wrote it for his paper, passed the course with an A+. He used the same idea for 4 other papers, different aspects. It wasn't copying, it was going deeper and deeper, and he used it for his examinations, which he passed very easily. He then published it in the #1 journal and turned the world of linguistic theory upside down. It was dramatic. Now, how did this happen? How did these 3 people succeed even though they did well in school. I happen to know what happened to Larry because Larry Hyman's advisor was also my advisor, and she was wonderful, Victoria Fromkin. She arranged it so school was a place where Larry and me, we could follow our own interests. She helped us discover things we liked and helped us go deeper in the area. That's what school should do. Graduate school was wonderful for both of us. I wish it were true for everybody. I assume this is what happened to Madame Curie. I hypothesize this is what happened to Oppenheimer. Well, I have given my talk today. Let me now restate the whole thing in a more boring way. What I'm going to claim, I'm going to talk about the development of literacy and how we learn to read and write, and big vocabularies and all that. And I'm going to talk about how we get smart. How both of those things happen. Different but kind of parallel processes. So in the next 45 minutes, I will give you a short course in language acquisition and literacy and a short course in developmental cognitive psychology, all for the same price. My claim, as some of you know by now, is language acquisition and literacy development happen in only one way. It's a very Chomskyan view. The brain only works in one way, just like the liver only works in one way, the kidneys only work in one way. There's very little individual variation among people this way. And the way we acquire language and develop literacy is by comprehension. We're going to call this the comprehension hypothesis. We acquire language when we understand what people tell us, when we understand what we read and when we understand what we hear. This is called comprehensible input. Oh yes, thank you. Okay. All right. Okay. The way this works, we call this the comprehension hypothesis. You read good books, hear stories, have conversations. The result are the skills. Things like vocabulary, grammar, knowledge of text structure so you can write well, spelling, etc. The important thing here is that the skills, vocabulary and grammar, are the result. Comprehension is the cause. This is the comprehension hypothesis. The rival hypothesis we call the skill-building hypothesis. The skill-building hypothesis makes the causality go in the other direction. Remember the English course that you took in school? Do you remember what they did? First, you learned a list of vocabulary words, and you learned grammar rules. You practice the grammar rules by saying things, getting your errors corrected, and by writing things. So the causality is backwards. First, you consciously learn the rules. Let me put this down here. Skill building. You consciously learn the rules, so you consciously do the skills. You practice them over and over. And someday, you can actually use the language. We call this a delayed gratification hypothesis. Okay? It's kind of like old-fashioned religion. Be good, and then someday you'll get your reward. Okay? Things like that. So you see that skill building and comprehension are exactly the opposite. The cause-effect relationship is reversed. Someday never comes. There is not a single person on this planet ever who has ever acquired language this way. Our studies, I've spent the last 40 years hoping that I've demonstrated that it simply doesn't work. That comprehensible input is far more effective, and that skill building has always been a disaster. It has failed in every single study we've done, every single study I've read. Not only does it fail in the research, skill building is painful. My observation is that 95% of students in skill-based classes hate it. The 5% who like it become language teachers. You see what the problem is? So the comprehension hypothesis is win-win. It works, and it's pleasurable. It has to be pleasurable. The input has to be interesting, or nobody would pay attention. Skill building is lose-lose. It's painful, and it doesn't work. The problem is, for the public, the skill building hypothesis is the only thing that exists. For the public, skill building, they have never heard of the comprehension hypothesis. They assume skill building is correct. This is our problem. If you think the skill building hypothesis is right, all the ways that we torture children in school make perfect sense. All the grammar drills, all the workbooks, all the tests, perfectly fine. My goal is to lower the status of skill building from axiom to hypothesis. That would be very nice. I think it's false, but at least let's open it up. Now let me tell you how literacy is developed. Literacy is developed because of the comprehension hypothesis. A special case of the comprehension hypothesis is the reading hypothesis. And the reading hypothesis says that the way we develop literacy is by reading. How about that? It's a new idea. You would think it's a brand new idea. And the kind of reading that counts the most is the reading you did last night before you went to sleep. How many of you read last night before you went to sleep? How many of you, like me, read last night even though it was too late? This is reading addiction, right? It's so pleasant you can hardly put it down. Exactly. Free voluntary reading, we think, at the basis of our research the last 4 decades, free voluntary reading is the source of our reading ability, our ability to write with a reasonable writing style, our ability to handle complex grammatical constructions. Most of our educated vocabulary comes from reading, and most of our spelling comes from reading. And again, this is study after study that has shown this. I want to present a kind of new hypothesis today. Let me give you some advice. You want to be a big shot like me? Wouldn't that be nice? Go around, give presentations, and people take you to lunch and tell you how smart you are. It's really good. I like it. It's great stuff. You want to know the secret? Yes. Invent new terminology. Make sure that your new terminology is not quite clear. If it's too obvious, you get no respect. If people aren't quite sure what you're talking about, they think you're a lot smarter than they are. And this has worked for me. Like, you've seen my stuff, most of you. Remember I+1? Yeah. No one has any idea what that means. I really succeeded with that one. What's that? Oh, he must be much more subtle and intelligent than I am. Anyway, I got a new, and you have to keep coming up with new things. My hero in show business is Madonna. Because Madonna keeps, as they say, reinventing herself. And that's what I have to do if I want to keep my act going. So here's this week's hypothesis. It'll probably be too comprehensible, that's the problem. I want to claim that we move from the lowest levels of literacy to the highest levels of literacy by going through universal stages. And each stage leads to the next, prepares you. So I've called it the conduit hypothesis. So you have no idea what that means. It's great. All right. It means each stage is a conduit, leads you on to the next. And you have gone through this. Most of you have gone through this in two languages. So you know how it works. And I'm going to claim it works for first language and for second language. I'm going to give you just a brief look at the research, because all the research is there, man. You can read it. Check out my website, by the way. Operators are standing by. Please check this out. Tell all your friends. My articles are here, folks, and they're free. Free download. Don't ask me for permission. So, birthdays, right? Good birthday presents, my articles. Weddings, bar mitzvahs, you can share it with everybody, okay? A little footnote here. This is serious, we're in big trouble understanding what the research is, practitioners, because it's so expensive, you can't find it. The journals are too expensive, the books are too expensive. So many of us are making it available for free, not because we're nice, but because otherwise no one's going to see it. So you can check out my stuff there, all free, go for it, and share it with your friends. Okay, I'm just going to give you the results. I'm going to claim there are 3 stages. The first stage, stories. Stories are of universal interest. We interpret our lives as a narrative. We are the heroes of the story that's going on. We are the protagonist. And everybody likes stories. Isn't that true? My wife keeps telling me, put in more stories in the talk, it'll be better. She's absolutely right. You need things to illustrate. Not only do I want to share this research with you, but I'd like to make a suggestion to improve your social life and show you how important stories are. If you're invited to a party and you don't know anybody, you know what to do. Go out and watch the last 3 popular movies. Isn't it true? And you can always start a conversation. And what's interesting about it, you can go up to 3 people, mention the latest movie, someone will have seen it, 1 out of the 3, and you'll have a good conversation. Guaranteed. Because people understand stories, and they have their own interpretations. It's like a good literature class, and everyone has a good time. Oh, the last flight I was on, coming back from Hong Kong, someone has to explain Deadpool to me. Oh my, anyway, it did keep my attention, no question. All right. So, in first language, it's stories that gets things moving. Hearing stories at home from mommy and daddy. Hearing stories from your teacher at school. Children who hear more stories are way ahead in school than kids who don't hear stories. The case history I want to share with you is my own. I'm going to tell you about my development in my first language, in English. And when I talk about my own life, I really wish I could tell you a story about how I overcame obstacles and how brave I was and courageous. And despite all these things against me, I succeeded, but none of this is true. I have a very privileged, easy life. Everything is made easy. I came from a home with no family pathology. Nothing. Mommy and Daddy got along very well. My sister, I'll never understand my sister. She's 3.5 years older than I am, and she still behaves like she's my mother. Isn't that true? Your older sister phenomena? She calls me, are you doing okay? I said, all right, can I help you with this? You need anything? Yeah. I never help her. She's always doing this. She read stories to me when we were little kids. She got me involved in radio stories, okay? And when I tell you this, please give her a round of applause. When I was 9 years old, my sister took me to the local public library and got me a library card. So I couldn't miss in school. I had all these things. So stories do work. The research supports it thoroughly. In language studies, in second language studies, we've now gotten much more interested in stories. I get credit for Natural Approach. Tracy Terrell and I, it was really Tracy, but I get credit for it anyway. And I like natural approach. I think it's really good, but I think they're doing better now. The current methods are better. Methods such as TPRS, Blaine Ray, Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling, where the teacher and the student co-construct stories in class, and a method called story listening. My colleague Benico Mason has been teaching English this way, using stories from Grimm's fairy tales, which he makes interesting and comprehensible, and the results are excellent. So we see this initial stage in first language and second language. Well, after all the stories, you move into the next stage. Stage number 2 is an extended period of time where you do lots of self-selected reading on your own. The same thing Michael Faraday went through. Years and years of reading basura, junk. Books that your teachers do not approve of. Books that your parents are not too sure about, right? The research on this is dramatic. We have overwhelming evidence that people who do more free voluntary reading, again, grow in everything. We have wonderful studies that keep backing it up. Again, rather than go through the research, I'll tell you about my adventures. And I'm telling you this because we are similar, not because we're different. You went through the same thing I went through, and I hope those of you older, so are your children. We all went through the free voluntary reading stage, but we had different details. In my case, there were 3 sub-stages. The first sub-stage was comic books. Oh my, comic books. I owe this to my father, who got me started in comics. I did fine in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. About third grade or so, I started falling behind the other kids because they all came from print-rich environments too. This was a middle-class neighborhood. There weren't kids with poverty there. Everybody had a lot of books around. Some of the kids were better readers than I was. They were doing more reading at home, etc. So my father got a little concerned because I was in the kind of low reading group. He did something that I think changed the world. He brought home comic books. And my father told me I could buy all the comic books I wanted to, no limit. Applause for my father. Yes. Now the comics I got into in those days, this was in the 1940s, okay, early 1950s. By the way, I'm telling you all this. You can probably figure out how old I am if you care. I'm happy to tell you. I like telling people how old I am. I am now 75, but I read at the 80-year-old level. Anyway, my dad brought home comic books, and they were the comics of the 1940s in the United States. This was called the golden age of comics, but it really wasn't. Things got better after that. It was Batman. It was Superman. It was a guy called Captain Marvel. Okay, I remember him. I don't know whatever happened to him. Anyway, they were pretty good. I loved them. I just ate them up. My friends and I, we traded comics. All we did was read comics. Today, comics are much, much better. The big change came in 1961 with the forming of the Marvel comic book company. One man is responsible, Stan Lee, absolutely. He has little cameos in the movies. Okay? If you're nice to me, I'll tell you about the time I had lunch with Stan Lee. My biggest honor. That was great. Okay, I'll tell you all about it. Let me tell you how it happened. I was teaching at USC, and the comic book club invited Stan Lee. And I was busy listening to a lecture on relative clauses in Japanese. So I snuck out, and I went to the next building, and there was Stan Lee giving a lecture, answering questions. And the kids in the audience were my people, the nerds. Okay? I felt right at home. Okay. So I sat down, and here's Stanley. He was absolutely brilliant. And at the end, question time, of course I raised my hand. And I said, when is Peter Parker going to graduate school? He should be studying physics or chemistry in graduate school. Because, you know, he invented the web slingers, you know, all that stuff. So he's a great scientist. So he said, that's a good idea. Let's talk. Stanley invited me to lunch. So I had lunch with Stanley. We met in the valley, in San Fernando Valley, and I brought him all these notes about what it's like to be a grad student. Okay? And he took the notes, he studied them, all that, took them home. And we had this great conversation. The whole time I was with him, we talked about comics. I mean, Stanley is the real thing. His favorite character, the Silver Surfer. The most tortured character in the Marvel universe. The one with the biggest problems. The welfare of his family versus the fate of the universe. What could be tougher? Oh, it was wonderful. Anyway, he actually used the idea. I got into the Sunday comic strip briefly. He had Peter Parker visit the college, see if he wanted graduate school, and the professor looked like me. It was my moment of fame. Anyway, what Stanley did was make comics into real literature. Spider-Man being the most important character, I think, in American literature, really. A superhero with problems, as you know, lots of problems. Problems with his girlfriend, with his job, of still feeling guilty about his uncle, and he could have saved his uncle, etc. And of course, all the rest of them, the X-Men, they all have problems. They all have real struggles and, you know, conflicts. This has swept over into DC. Of course, it began with Marvel, but the influence on DC has been very, very good, I think. And DC has also become more sensitive to the literary aspect of comics. That comics are really, the plots are an exercise in ethics. My favorite of the graphic novels that's come out of DC is the classic that maybe a third of you have read, and that's Batman Returns of Frank Miller. It's amazing, it changed everything. Batman is now 56 years old. He's still going out fighting crime. He comes back, his back hurts, his neck hurts. He takes a hot bath, takes aspirin, it would be ibuprofen now probably. But he's still doing it. He no longer pays attention to Commissioner Gordon. He's become Dirty Harry. He has his own set of ethics. Superman is still conservative. Superman says, if the government asks me to do it, I do it. They meet, they're still friends. They have long conversations. I think they should have met in Starbucks. Went to some mountaintop. Anyway, and the comic presents the conflict without taking sides, which I thought was excellent. The biggest conflict you can have. Do I follow my own ethical standards, or do I go along with society? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, etc. One of the Marvel movies, Iron Man 2, really went after this very well, I thought. When Tony Stark was subpoenaed by the Senate, remember that? And they say, you know, you've got this, you know, Iron Man costume, and you go around blowing things up. You can't do that. You're a civilian. You've got to turn it over to the military. And Tony Stark says, nothing doing. I'm doing stuff you should be doing. The movie does not take a position. Simply presents the problem as a problem. So comics today are literature in the sense that they deal with the major questions of life. Ethics, how are we supposed to behave? Metaphysics, why are we here? So this is heavy, heavy stuff, and they're not so easy. From comics, I moved into sports stories. And what I did in sports stories is I fell in love with the work of one author, a guy named John R. Tunis, who wrote baseball stories. I read every one of John R. Tunis's novels. They were gripping. He focused on one pretend baseball team, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and, you know, a made-up group of players, and he took them series through, you know, years and years, from beginning all the way through, you know, 10 years of baseball. Yes, it was about home runs. It was about stolen bases. It was about the players and their lives. The last one, whether you speak baseball or not, you will understand this. The last book in the series, and the best one, was called World Series, which is the United States version of the World Cup. They call it the World Series, which is kind of weird. It's the United States and one Canadian team, okay? Anyway, look, they elected Trump. What more do you want? Okay. Disaster. Anyway, it is my patriotic duty to criticize Trump everywhere I go. Anyway, it's the last game of the World Series. Each team has won 3 games, and this is the one that makes the difference, and it's the last part of the game. We call it the last inning. Now in baseball, it's always the duel between the guy who throws the ball, the pitcher, the batter. The pitcher is the father. The batter is the son. And they haven't spoken for 15 years. That's good writing. And he builds you up to that through the whole series of books. If you want to find out what happened, you're going to have to read it yourself. I'm sorry. Okay. After baseball, I went on to science fiction. And that was the golden age of science fiction, no question. That was Isaac Asimov. That was Arthur C. Clarke, Ray Bradbury. There was so much to read, and they were so good. In secondary school, this was my curriculum. I remember we did literature class in school, and I read the assigned books, and I took tests on them. I don't remember any of them. Somebody named Shakespeare, right? I don't know. These books, I remember every single one. Just like you've done this too, you go back and pick up a book that you read in junior high school, still good, isn't it? There's still some young people's literature is among the best literature ever, in my opinion, and this was no exception. This did not bring me to the highest level of literacy, but it brought me to the point where harder things were more comprehensible. This is why it's a conduit. Stage 2 brings you to the bridge, to higher forms. Now the highest form of literacy we call academic literacy. I'm not too happy with that term, academic. I would prefer specialized, because academic sends the message that it's university that counts, that you should be reading, history text, Beowulf, and mathematics books and all that. And if you're not doing that, it's no good. No, university is certainly not for everybody. It's not better, it's different. People who go into what we call the trades, artisans, have the same intelligence, it's just used for different things. So I prefer to call it specialized literacy. There was a member of the cabinet, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, about 15 years ago, John Gardner, who said this: if we praise mediocre philosophy and we disrespect competent plumbing, neither our theories nor our pipes will hold water. And this has been the problem. So let's talk. In my case, it was definitely academic literacy. I'm one of the 1% for whom the pure intellectual life was just right. But I realize it's not better, it's different. So I finally found what I wanted to do after I finished college, when I discovered the field of linguistics. I realized that was for me. So I went to school in linguistics. The first course I took, general linguistics, fine. The second course, syntactic theory. The textbook was Aspects of the Theory of Syntax by the dreaded Noam Chomsky. I picked it up, I understood nothing. It could have been written in Bulgarian, completely incomprehensible. So let me tell you what I did. I went back 15 years, and I found Chomsky's very first publication, Syntactic Structures. I read that. That was okay. It's a little slow, but I really liked it. I like linguistics. I'm part of this fringe group, okay? I loved it. It took me a while, but I got through it, and I admired it. When I finished Syntactic Structures, pamphlet of about 60 pages, I then went on to his next publication, Current Issues in Linguistic Theory. Made perfect sense. Then I went to his journal papers, what he said, the responses, what the responses were. In 1 month, I did all the reading up to aspects of the theory of syntax. When I picked up aspects of the theory of syntax, it was obvious. It was completely transparent. I read this stuff because I loved what Chomsky was saying. Without realizing it, I learned how a scientist thinks, and I began to acquire academic language. That's where it came from. Now, I don't know Noam Chomsky. We're not friends. We don't meet at Starbucks and hang out or something. I know our names are sometimes linked together, but I don't really know him. I met him once at my university. He came to give a talk. I shook hands. I said, "I'm Steve Krashen." He said, "Who?" That was it. But Chomsky was my teacher. I owe him so much because I learned I replicated this when I did my dissertation research. This was in the early 70s. In those days, the hot topic was left-right brain differences, and I was swept up in that. It was really interesting. And I did my dissertation on what the left does, what the right does, and we use a technique called dichotic listening. You put headsets on people, one ear hears one thing, one ear hears the other, and they tell you what they hear, and you can see which side of the brain is processing. I was responsible for setting up the experiments. I read the entire literature on dichotic listening, beginning with the first paper ever done. I found out there was one person who dominated the field, invented the technique. Her name, Doreen Kimura, a professor from Western Ontario. I read every single paper that she did. Actually, psychology papers are only about 3 pages. They're much easier than what we have to look at. They're much more sensible. I read what she did. I read what her colleagues did. I read it because I wanted to know about dichotic listening. In reading it, I learned how to read scientific papers. I got the literacy of scientific papers, and I learned how to apply statistics. I have never met Doreen Kimura. I'm sure she's never heard of me. She was one of my teachers. Let me come to some conclusions about these stages. In stages 2 and 3, all the reading was self-selected. And it was narrow. I didn't try to read everything. My claim is this is the only way we make progress. Everything I've been assigned, I have forgotten. Same with you. Everything I've decided to read because I needed it now, I remember. I'll return to this topic. And everything I read was compelling. So interesting, it took me into another world. The same thing that happens to you when you see a great movie, you read a great novel. You get completely absorbed. This is the entire theory of how we become literate. We find compelling things that we want to read on our own path, things we want to know about. We get swept up. We don't study how to write academic papers. We read a lot of them and we absorb it. Well, that's how we get literate. Let's go to cognitive development, the parallel process. Oh, where am I here? Oh, this is yesterday's handout. This is about how to get rich in the stock market. Yeah, I can tell you about that. You want the secrets of financial success? Oh, I got 2 ways of doing it. The stock market, there is a way of doing it. It's not buying and selling. It's giving seminars on getting rich in the stock market. My way of getting rich, I recommend to everybody, and I don't know why everybody doesn't do this, but it really helped me. It's one word: inheritance. Check it out. Okay? There's no money in education. Okay, once you understand that, things get a lot easier. Okay. It's probably the only thing you're going to remember from today's song. My inheritance didn't make me rich, but it sure helped, during grad school, etc. Okay, I'm going to talk about how we get smart, and I'm going to divide this into several aspects. I'm going to talk about what the path is like, see it on your handout, how pleasant it is, why it is the gateway to long-term memory, and then I'll show you how to do it yourself. Okay? The path. Let's begin with Picasso. The meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. A similar quote from Mark Twain. The two most important days of your life, the day you're born and the day you discover why. We all have our own path, and it's different for every one of us. Our biggest problem as we're growing up is to figure out what we're supposed to be doing. We're all specialized. Einstein said it, famous quote from Einstein, I think I have it down here. Everyone's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its whole life believing that it's stupid. Beethoven talked about this. Beethoven wouldn't have gotten through the 5th grade in our schools today. He says, Beethoven, talking about himself, Beethoven can write music, thank God, but he can do nothing else on earth. He found his path, get better at it. The field I think is good for analogy here is sports. Let's talk about basketball for a moment. You know what basketball is? You get dressed in your underwear and you run around bouncing a ball and throwing it into. I've never understood this. Anyway, in the United States, as you know, in basketball there are different positions. You can be a guard and you shoot the ball a lot and pass it around. You can be a forward, or you can be the center. The center is the big guy in the middle and jumps and taps the ball. You'd think they're kind of similar, but they really are different. If you're a basketball player, you discover early in life which position you're supposed to be playing. You don't switch around very much. Same is true in soccer, football. If you're a goalie, you're a goalie. You don't tell the goalie to play forward. They know baseball is the most specialized. The catcher will never be the center fielder, and no one tries to make the people change. This is very important. Basketball is so interesting because in 1985, it was the big final game. It was the Los Angeles Lakers against the Boston Celtics, this big rivalry. And the championship game, the Lakers center was the most famous player in basketball, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Remember him? And he was amazing. He was wonderful. He got injured. Couldn't play. The guard played center. The guard was Magic Johnson. The guard had not played center since junior high school. Magic Johnson went out into the court with a big smile, played center, scored 56 points, and they won the game. That was considered so unusual that every year, on the anniversary of that game, there's an article in the Los Angeles Times. This is the anniversary of the day when Magic Johnson played center. Even though to the average person it looks like it's pretty much this. We accept specialization in sports. Wonderful article I read in a book about aging. It's called Don't Go to Your Left. In high school basketball, secondary school basketball, the coaches encourage players to learn to use their left hand, like, dribbling the ball. Learn to do it with your left. Shooting the ball, learn to do it with your left hand. Then your opponents won't know where you're coming from. The author says, big mistake. If you're always working on your weak spots, you'll never get good at anything. Does that explain your frustrations in school? They always want us to work on our weak spots. That's the problem. So part of finding out what you're supposed to be doing is to be willing to specialize. The pleasure of your path. problem solving is pleasant. Oh boy, and you know that when you find the right thing. There's a wonderful book called The Ultimate Seduction, which I highly recommend. And it's The Ultimate Seduction is from a quote by Picasso. Work is the ultimate seduction. It's interviews with famous people of how they get through the day and how absorbed they are with their work and how much they love it. Top physicists, Nobel Prize winners keep talking about what a good time they're having in the laboratory. They put in long hours because they love what they're doing. The tasks, Vonnegut is really great for quotes. He says, the tasks are not harrowing challenges, but rather tasks we find natural and interesting. Tasks we're apparently born to perform. I remember talking to my friend Larry Hyman. He did work in phonological theory, and I was working in syntax and left-right brain differences. And we kept observing each other, working in our specialty, and I would see Larry solve these problems in phonological theory. I'd say, how do you do that? And he would see me doing my work in neurological stuff, and he would say, how did you do that? Because we had each found our path, things that were interesting to us. Problem solving is the key to long-term memory. Smart people never study. The key to having an encyclopedic knowledge is years of problem solving. Linus Pauling, when he died, knew more about chemistry than anyone on earth. Linus Pauling didn't study. He didn't wake up every morning and review the periodic table with flashcards. Instead, he spent his time trying to solve every major problem in the field of chemistry and enjoyed himself. My favorite Linus Pauling story, he tried everything. He was working in everything. He was physical chemistry when he was a young man. Later on, he got involved with the double helix, with DNA and all that. And he was right behind Crick and Watson in the big discovery. Crick and Watson who found, the spiral diagram and did the research. Pauling was their rival. And it was this big race. Who would get there first? Okay. Well, Crick and Watson won. They got there first. They sent the solution to Pauling. Pauling wrote them immediately. Pauling was thrilled. He took a look at their diagram and said, this is wonderful. I am so happy. It's the pleasure of the work, not winning or losing the competition, that makes these people different, because they like it so much. Here's some evidence for this. Chomsky again. Chomsky, there's an article he wrote in one of his political books about listening to the radio. Can you imagine? Chomsky's driving along at night, listening to call-in radio sports talk. I have a hard time imagining Noam Chomsky listening to, baseball, football, basketball, sports talk, but there he is. And he noticed this. Chomsky's very interested in this idea of how smart the average person is. We don't give average people credit for much intelligence, but you find the right area, they're very smart. Sports. He says the average person calling up to these sports shows knows a lot. They have encyclopedic knowledge of sports and incredible talent in critical thinking. He says when people call up, uneducated people, not highly literate people, and they make their criticism of what the team should have done, the argument is never stupid, ever. It's always a good argument. You may disagree. They have encyclopedic knowledge of the players, all the statistics and all the different possibilities, etc. In other words, the average person has great powers of learning. They have encyclopedic knowledge of these fields. Now, Chomsky's point, which is a little different than mine, but I'll include it for completeness, he says that we tell these people, politics is too difficult. Leave it to us, the experts. But Chomsky says understanding the subtleties of professional soccer is much harder than understanding political economy. But they tell you, leave it alone, we'll take care of it. Okay? So we ignore people, we take their intelligence, we channel it into areas where they can have no effect. Frank Smith, talks about all the research on learning, what we call the laws of learning. You know, you need so many repetitions and so many reinforcements. He points out all of that research is based on research with nonsense syllables. When you put meaning into the discussion, all of that changes. Sometimes one repetition is enough if you learn something that you need to learn. Let me recite some romantic poetry to you. Do you love me or do you not? You told me once, but I forgot. The reason that's nonsense is that you don't forget things like that. The telephone rings. You and your cousin have just gotten a ticket for the lottery, okay? And your cousin calls and says, guess what? We won. We won 10,000 US dollars, and come on over, I'll give you your share. Great. You don't put down the phone and say, who called? What was that about? How much did I win? One repetition is enough if it solves a problem for you. I have a teacher friend back in the States from Texas named Donna Lynn Miller, who I think is very brilliant. And I went to a seminar she gave, and she was with a group of middle school literature teachers, about 100 of them in the room. And she asked this question: how many of you have a student who's an expert in World War II? 10 hands go up. How many of you have a student who's an expert on fish? 7 hands go up. Kids discover their interests and they become brilliant in those areas. It can be on the subtle details of Minecraft, Pokemon, but when they start solving problems, they know absolutely everything. My son was interested in Dungeons and Dragons when he was in school. He's now all grown up. And I asked him, how hard was Dungeons and Dragons compared to what you did in school? He said, Dungeons and Dragons is 10 times as hard. But they love it, and they master it, and they learn all these things that they could never get by study. So problem solving is the gateway. Well, let me tell you what the method is and how to do it, how to make yourself smarter. It all comes from a book written in 1923 called The Art of Thought. And in this book, Graham Wallace says there are several stages in problem solving. You get smart by solving problems. So how do we do them? The first stage is isolate the problem. You do this by writing, by figuring it out. You do all the mathematics, you get the message. You try to figure out what is it that I'm looking for. You try to state the problem to yourself clearly. Then he says, take a rest. The next stage is incubation. Take some time off. Then the answer comes to you from the other side. Then make sure you write it down. Because if you don't write it down, you'll forget it. He tells the story of the man who had such a wonderful idea. He sank to his knees to thank God, rose up and found he'd forgotten it. So make sure you write it down, okay? I want to now go through how smart people read and write in agreement with Graham Wallace's stages. And we see that smart people read and write in very interesting ways. First, they read a lot. Smart people read a lot more than not smart people. Just like Faraday read a lot. This is where they find their path. So there's this huge period of what we call omnivorous reading that nearly every eminent person has gone through. They learn things about the world. They read what they want to read, as you see here. It's selective reading. And they read lots of fiction. How do you like that? In the United States today, the emphasis is on nonfiction. Do you know why? It's easier to test. And that's where the money is. I am so cynical. Okay? But the value is fiction. The research that shows that reading is good for you is largely reading fiction. And that's what gives you vocabulary, knowledge, all these things, and what we call habits of mind, a sense of how other people are thinking, etc. Now, how do smart people write? Smart people write to solve problems. And they use strategies that the language arts people have come up with that are extremely helpful. The big one is when they write, they revise. Revision is a way of stimulating all those ideas that are there in your subconscious. When you write something down, your mind automatically goes to work on it and comes up with a better idea. Then you change it. In a sentence, writing makes you smarter. It's a powerful way of solving problems and coming up with new ideas. And revision is how it happens. Smart people also, when they write, don't edit while they're writing. They don't worry about their spelling mistakes. They don't worry about their punctuation. They do that later. They pretend that they've hired someone else to do that, and then when they're done, they hire themselves, and they take care of the spelling, etc. It's actually a good idea. What they say is right. If you stop and edit what you're doing as you're writing, you're constantly interrupted, and the version you're working on now is not going to be your final version anyway. The best advice I have ever heard on writing comes from Ernest Hemingway, and this advice, this one sentence, has helped me enormously. The first draft of anything is shit. That is heavy, heavy stuff. That relieves you of the responsibility of turning out quality work when you first sit down. Realize you're going to go through draft after draft after draft. So it's foolish to pay attention and edit everything as you're doing it, because you're going to change it. Don't put on your makeup before your shower. I would never do that. So good writers go through this process, and they take advantage of incubation. My favorite researcher who wrote about incubation is a mathematician named Poincaré. Poincaré lived about the time of Einstein. Einstein was very dependent on his work for the theory of relativity. Poincaré wrote an article on creativity that is in every collection I've ever seen. This is written about 100 years ago. He says, when I get stuck, I stop what I'm doing, I get up, I put some wood on the fire. That's all. Then I come back. I do something mindless and ordinary. Poincaré's article has made my life so much better. My wife says I should tell stories. Here's a story. Let me tell you what I do in hotel rooms. The whole story. The whole truth. When I go into a hotel room, for some reason, a poltergeist takes over. And all my clothes are spread out all over the room within 10 minutes. Does this happen to you? My toothbrush is on top of the television set. I don't know how it got there. My underwear is in the bathtub. How did it get here? The room is a disaster. Well, I have to clean it up because the person's going to come and clean it up, so you don't want to be embarrassed. So here's what I do. I start working. I start writing. Like today, my writing assignment, and last night, I wanted to finish a letter to the editor I was working on. My colleague, Benito Mason, did a short paper. I was going over it, rewriting, looking at parts, making suggestions. I had some writing I had to do. So I started doing them. I sit down and start writing. Within 2 minutes, I have my first writer's block. My life is writer's block after writer's block. That's all it is. Does that make you feel better? That's all it is. I get up, I take the underwear out of the shower, and I put it away. That's it. I don't try to clean up, it's too boring. Then I go back and write some more, or read some more. Reading, my mind will wander. I get up. I take one shirt out of the suitcase, hang it up. At the end of the evening, I'm unpacked, the room is clean, and I've done my work. I learned this from Poincaré. This is how to use all what we call the inauthentic labor of life. At home, I do the dishes. I love doing the dishes. I can take a 20-minute job doing the dishes, and I can get it done in 2 hours. Because I'm doing my work. I bring the computer into the kitchen, You do some work, have a block, do a few dishes. Do some work, have a block, do a few dishes. This all comes from Poincaré. So we want to build bricks into our life. Well, I've already come to my conclusions. I've said we get the language, the intellectual language, the specialized language, through going through these 3 stages. And we get our ideas through solving problems. This is how we grow intellectually. And when we write them up and think about them, we make new discoveries. Well, I left out one piece of great evidence. Let me give you that before I come to the conclusions. A letter written to an advice columnist, Ann Landers, back in 1982. Goes like this. Woman writes in asking for advice. Dear Ann, should I marry the guy or not? Let me tell you what the problems are. He's 31, he behaves as if he were 14. He can't hold a job, he's borrowed money from me 3 times. My parents don't like him, and he's jealous. He brings me home after a date. He then goes home, calls me up again 15 minutes later. He says he just wants to say goodnight. I know, he's suspicious. He thinks I'm going out with someone else. One night I was in the shower, I didn't hear the phone. I got up the next morning at 6:30, he was asleep on the front porch. Now the good things. He's very good looking. I find him physically attractive. That's about all. I've been sitting here for 10 minutes, pen in hand, and I can't think of another good thing to say about him. Don't bother answering this letter. You've helped me more than you can imagine. Writing makes you smarter. You have a problem, you write it down in your diary, 10% goes away. Isn't that true? It's always like that. So what should school do? Coming to some conclusions here. School should help students discover their interests and help them develop their interests. Right now, school is doing the absolute opposite, in my opinion. School should not worry about society's current needs. It's happening in the United States, and I have seen influence of this every country I've been. The United States has decided that we have a shortage of scientists. We call it STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. We want people to go in these technical fields so we can catch up with the Chinese or someone, whoever is, you know. I don't understand economics, I really don't. This idea of beating other countries is kind of weird, because if we win and China loses, and they have no money, we don't want that, because then they can't buy our stuff. Economics has to be win-win, or it doesn't make sense. Anyway, be that as it may, now all these little kids, my grandchildren are in this, where you're supposed to learn how to code and become a computer scientist, etc. First of all, if it were true, this is not the way to do it. You're not going to force kids to do things they don't want to do, and the needs 20 years from now are going to be different than the needs today. Also, in terms of science, technology, engineering, and math, in the United States, there is no shortage. There's a surplus. All the research says that. We have too many engineers, too many computer people, too many mathematicians. They can't find jobs. They're all in Starbucks on their computer looking for work. Okay? Why do they have this? Well, this is my cynical part. Famous American comedian Lily Tomlin says that her cynicism is having trouble keeping up with the times. This is how I feel. There's no shortage, they just want permission to bring in more foreign workers that are cheaper. They want more visas, so it's just a way for the companies to make money. In other words, we shouldn't worry about current needs. We should help kids find their own interests. All the needs will be taken care of. You don't want everybody doing the same thing. Society is then going to have real problems if we don't have people to do many different kinds of work. What about study skills? Shouldn't kids have study skills? Have you taken classes in study skills? We are shown how to outline, take notes, review. Great study was done in this in the 50s. And they found that the best students had lousy study skills. You know, they waited till the last minute before they reviewed for the test. Okay? They didn't take good notes, etc. The conclusion was they need a class in study skill. No, this means that it's just absolutely silly. It doesn't work. We don't learn that way. We learn by trying to solve problems. Well, what about the basics? If we let kids do what they want, how do we make sure they have the fundamentals that everyone needs? Now, I agree there are some basics. My colleague Susan Ohanian has a good recommendation for what everybody should know. By the time you finish elementary school, you should be pretty comfortable with arithmetic. You agree with that? I think so. Adding, subtracting, division, those things. Not calculus. By the time you finish elementary school, you should be a dedicated, independent reader reading things you like. After that, it's up to you. Yao Zheng, a really bright guy at the University of Oregon, has this hypothesis, and I don't know if it's true, but it's a very exciting hypothesis. If we let children go after what they want, they'll not only get the basics, they will run after the basics because they're going to need them to follow their interests. That's my presentation. Thank you for your patience.